In 2019, at the age of 26, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety and referred to a mental health clinic. I spent 12 weeks in therapy, and over the past 4 years, I've been on a journey of self-discovery. I still struggle with my mental health sometimes, but more than anything, I've learned a lot more about who I am and have a deeper understanding of myself, and this is my story. So I guess the best place to start is probably the very beginning. And when I was a kid, especially when I was a toddler and kind of just starting school, I really struggled sleeping. I never slept when I was a kid. I used to hallucinate a lot. So my mum and dad actually moved house because I used to hallucinate. And I would stand at the bottom of the stairs and point to the top of the stairs and see clowns and stuff. And mum and dad moved house. And when we moved house, the clowns followed us. So that carried on, and I just couldn't sleep. And I'm sure the hallucination was the not sleeping, and then that would make me sleep less, and I'd never sleep. And my mum used to have to sit in the doorway with me with the light on until I just nodded off and drifted away because I'd see monkeys and stuff on my wardrobe. And I was always quite extreme as a kid, you know. I think that's why I took to gymnastics so well, and the reason I got into gymnastics was because I was incredibly hyperactive, and I was like this fireball of energy when I was a child. And when I started gymnastics, you know, it really took a lot of my energy away, calmed me down a lot, and I started sleeping. I started being able to concentrate a little bit more at school. But that extreme behaviour that was always in me, and that real black and white lens that I kind of viewed life through, has almost stayed with me my whole life. And as a kid, you know, for me, it was always about you either win or you lose, like you're good or you're bad. And, you know, I got told off a lot when I was a kid because I was not necessarily, sometimes I was naughty, but it wasn't necessarily that. It's because I had too much energy and I couldn't concentrate, you know. I used to have these like voices in my head that almost were telling me to do things. When someone said, no, don't do that, I'd kind of go, go on, do it. And that got me into a lot of trouble when I was a kid. And as I kind of went into my teenage years and I started to do more and more gymnastics, and in many ways, I think me and gymnastics were a perfect fit, like a match made in heaven, because the sport's super extreme and it's all about being perfect, right? But it's impossible to be perfect. But for me, that was, you know, that was like the never-ending pursuit. And also at the same time, I think gymnastics does attract extreme personalities, kids with a lot of energy, kids that are maybe getting in trouble and are a bit naughty at school, and that was definitely the case for me. But also it kind of played on my extreme behaviour a little bit. And when I was a teenager growing up, you know, I actually remember one time, you know, I was training like 40 hours a week, and I can remember my dad was just picked me up from gym. It was probably like 8:30 at night. We were walking out of the gym, we'd walked down the leisure centre steps, and this kid was walking like next to us with his dad, and he had a football kit on, so he must have just played a football match. And but he knew my name because he said to his dad, oh, this is where Sam Oldham trains, and he trains 12 hours a day. And I looked at my dad and like smiled and laughed, because I'd never, ever in my life have ever trained 12 hours a day, but I did train 7 hours a day, and it was very extreme. And just through circumstance and some of the decisions that were made by me and also on my behalf as a teenager, I left home at 14 and lived with another family. And, you know, I became very isolated, almost like a little island by myself. And you know, I didn't have a lot of friends growing up, especially when I was a teenager. And I certainly didn't have a normal childhood. And that's a story from a lot of elite gymnasts and a lot of elite athletes. Like, I quit school when I was in year 9, basically. I dropped out of school. I homeschooled in Huntingdon, but I didn't really do it. I'd pretend I did my work for the first 5 minutes, and then the lady that I lived with and looked after me and made sure that I was doing my schoolwork would go to her job, and I would go upstairs and play on the PlayStation all morning. So at 14 years old, all I was doing was playing the PlayStation and doing gymnastics all day long. And to me, a kid that was hyperactive, was obsessed with the sport, that was like the perfect life for me. But it meant that because I wasn't at school and I wasn't interacting with kids my own age, I didn't learn how to do that. And I guess as I approached my senior career and when I turned 18 and I started hanging around with all these adults, and I'd go away on training camps and competitions with all of these adults, like grown men and senior gymnasts, I learned to communicate with them, but actually communicating with kids my own age was really, really difficult for me. And one thing that did come up, and what I'm going to do is you know, it's easy now in hindsight looking back at my career and my life and how I grew up and gymnastics and the impact that had on me and my personality. I think the 3 areas that were probably like red flags looking back where something could have been flagged or somebody could have probably noticed some of my behaviour that led up to me being diagnosed with depression, anxiety at 26. And I think the first one was certainly my behaviour around alcohol. So when I was up until 17, I never had a drink in my life. Like, I'd never had a drink. You know, I was the model athlete. I was like the ultimate professional. And Sergey and my dad were quite strict on stuff like that, so I would never have a drink. And I went to the World Championships at 17, and my coach wasn't there. Sergey wasn't there. Something had happened, and that's a story for another day, and he'd been sent home, and I was there with just the national coaches. And I didn't compete, but I was the reserve, so I did all the training, I did the podium session, and after the competition, the last night, gymnastics competition, you normally go out with everybody. Everybody goes out to celebrate and party. And one of the older lads, Theo, said to the national coach, "Oh, come on, let Sam go out with us." And he basically said, just don't get caught. So they took me out at 17, and the first time I've ever had a drink, never had a drink before. And to me, it was incredible, because as a teenager, I was so crippled with insecurity. And I actually remember having like extreme paranoia as a teenager. So I'd be in the gym and I'd hear my name in every conversation. I thought everybody was talking about me. And I think that's because I spend so much time by myself, just in my own head. But genuinely, I can remember a period of about a year, 18 months, I'd hear my name in every single conversation. I would hear it. I'd hear Sam, 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 and I think people were talking about me. And when I had this, this drink for the first time when we went out to this competition, I got really drunk, and that all went away. Like, all my insecurities and stuff went away, and I was able to talk to people and be myself. It felt like I was being myself, and the people around me liked that as well. Everyone seemed to be like laughing and joking with me, and they liked my company, and I really liked that feeling of feeling like I belonged in a group of other people. And the next year, a similar thing happened. I went to the Europeans in 2011. Senior debut, did incredibly well, came fourth. Again, we get to the after party at the competition. I got really drunk. I got taken back to the room, and Beth Tweddle at the time, she was like the mother of the group. I can remember she had to pack my bag for me because I couldn't even pack my bag. And like, people were noticing this behaviour. I think the adults and the coaches must have been noticing this, but it was kind of like a thing that was just kept quiet and brushed under the carpet. And then later that year, World Championships, I went into that competition under an incredible amount of pressure. I've told this story before. It's a competition where I had the broken collarbone and I tore my pec. And afterwards, we were there for a week, and I felt like it was my fault that all went wrong, because I was leading up to that competition. The decision was whether me or Max would compete, so I felt a lot of shame around that. I felt, it's my fault. This is why this has all gone wrong. We've missed out on the Olympic Games. And we started going out because we didn't have any competitions left. We'd go out and went out 2 or 3 nights in a row. And we'd gone out the first night, got pretty drunk, but it was fine. And the second night, I think it was the last night, and we had like a banquet. So all the team would go, and at the end of a competition, there's a big celebration. It's a big event. It's put on by the host. All the countries and the nations are there. And then quite often after that, the gymnasts will go out. And we went to the banquet. We had a great time. Went back to the hotel. And I was like, right, we're going out. And everyone said, no, we're not going out, Sam. Like, we're going to stay in the hotel. And I was like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Let's go out, man. This will be great. Because again, there was all these people my own age that, in many ways, from different countries that were like my friends. And I felt really accepted in that group. And so I rang up this lad from Norway and said, "Oh, you going out?" And he said, "Yeah." And I kind of went, "Max, I'm going out." And I just went out with this random lad from Norway and got really, really drunk, basically blacked out. Max came back to the room later that night, found me in a wheelchair. So Max opens the door, I'm in a wheelchair. He's come in, seen me in this wheelchair, panicked, thought I'd like broke my legs. I was just paralytically drunk. Someone must have brought me back to the hotel. The guy from the hotel must have taken me up to the room. I think the older lad showered me, like dressed me and stuff. And yeah, I got no memory of it, blacked out. Woke up the next morning and I was like, no. What? They were like, do you remember? I was like, no. And everyone just kind of like laughed it off at the time. And yeah, a pattern started to emerge then. And going into 2012, again, under extreme amounts of pressure, went to the Olympic Games. I fell on high bar in the team final, and my extreme kind of like personality and my black and white look on life, I've mentioned this before, but I couldn't compute how I'd won an Olympic medal and fell off. That didn't make sense in my head. And I felt that everybody else, if I'm feeling that in my head, all these people around me, they're not stupid. They know that. They're understanding that. They're thinking that. When they're smiling to me, but they're actually thinking you didn't deserve that. And so I kept this all in my head, and we started going out after the competitions, like after the Olympic Games, when everyone had finished. And we'd go out every single night, and these clubs would give us like 3 bottles of Ace of Spades champagne, and there'd be like girls and stuff, everything going on around me. And all I was doing, like at that point, because I felt so much pain inside me and this shame, and I was just drinking to make it go away. And I'd figured out, like, when I have a drink, I forget about all my worries and it all goes away. And that competition, actually, that was the big one. And this was a massive red flag. And, you know, I've been embarrassed about this for years and ashamed about it. And I can remember the night before this night, on my room of the Olympic Games in mine and Max's door, someone had put a picture up of a Belgium athlete that had got so drunk they'd basically wet himself and been sent home in disgrace. And they'd put that on the door and basically said, do not do this. So I've gone out that night, like, still got all of these feelings that I don't understand, because at 19, I'm not a well-rounded enough individual to handle 20,000 people watching me, millions of people on TV, the pressure, the feelings that I've got inside of me, these emotions. I don't know what's going on. And the only thing I've learned up to this point is to drink, and it all goes away. So we've gone out. I've got crazily drunk. Again, we're being fed alcohol and stuff. And they've taken me out the back door of this nightclub, this like big famous nightclub in London, then put in a taxi. They've taken me back. Again, I've ended up in a wheelchair. So at this point, I've now got the nickname Wheelchair Sam, which people laugh and joke about and like cheer on, which is really odd, you know. And no one had ever stopped to say, are you okay? Like, are you all right, Sam? And I remember having to go to the chef de mission. So the chef de mission is like the guy that is in charge of the whole team for the Olympic Games. I've been called to his office. And so I go in and I'm thinking, this is it. I'm going to be that lad from Belgium, and they're kicking me out of the Olympic Games, and I've disgraced my family, my country, my coach, British gymnastics. So I go into his office, and he's a guy that I'd known before. I'd met him when I was a kid, going to these Youth Olympic festivals. And he was a really nice guy, and he kind of took a liking to me. And I walked in and I thought, right, here we go, this is it. And he kind of looked at me and he smiled and he went, Sammy Oldham, come and sit down. And I thought, oh, it's going to be okay. And he actually was the only person that ever, I think, stopped me. And he said, Sam, I was really worried about you. Like, you're really young and I didn't want to see you in that state. That wasn't okay, you know. Like, I want to make sure you're all right. Is everything okay? And I didn't know what to say to him because he was the big boss. So I kind of lied and said, look, Mark, I'm really sorry. Like, I don't normally drink. And I don't. It's true. Like, I was the professional athlete for 6 months to 9 months. I'd never have a drink. So he said, okay, don't worry, make sure it never happens again. Next night, went out again the next night. It was unbelievable. And there was a security guard at the front of the village. So you had to leave the village where you put your passport in, and only somebody with an accreditation can get into the Olympic Village. And we walked past this security guard, and he starts shouting, and we're going on a night out again, the next night. And he starts shouting, Sam, what are you doing? Sam! And I'm looking back at him like, who the hell is this guy? I've never seen him. And everyone else in the team were like, don't you remember him? And I was like, no. He was like, he carried you into the Olympic Village and you threw up all over his suit. I was like, what? I did what? I couldn't believe it. Just kind of like smiled and laughed it off. We went on the rest of the night out, and then that behaviour continued for another 6 months once I got home. You know, I was doing the same thing. I had all these feelings still, and I was just drinking to make it all go away. And so that was the first thing, I think, that behaviour and that alcohol. And I think, you know, looking back now, I've seen that again. I've seen it in other athletes. And I always do try my best to like step in and just make sure they're okay and say, look, and there's people around them laughing and cheering them on, like, guys, like, this isn't okay, you know, like, you got to make sure that they're all right. This is like, we're athletes, like, this isn't alcohol and sport, they don't mix, they're not a good mix, you know, and kind of look at the root cause of the problem. But there was never any adults doing that. There was never any adults around me doing that, having those questions, like having those conversations, stepping in, Sam, are you okay? You're all right? You're handling the pressure and stuff. That never happened. So that was definitely the first one. And I think moving on up until 2016, you know, I matured, I got a little bit older, but post-2016, I think the big thing for me was that period where I was not selected for the Olympic Games. That was huge. That was a massive moment in my life. That was up until that point, I had like believed in. I'm not religious, but I believed in this. I had faith in that if you put the work in, and I'd been taught this since I was a child, if you put the work in and you work harder than everybody else, at the end you get what you deserve. And like that faith, I think in that had been like shattered at that point when I wasn't selected for the Olympic Games, because it didn't make sense to me. And I remember when, on that drive home after I had the phone call and I was told I'm not going to the Olympic Games, I remember getting to the top of the hill in my village just before I turned to like where I go up to where mum and dad live. And I genuinely put my foot down on the accelerator for a few seconds, full pelt, and I wanted to drive into the wall at the bottom of the hill. Now, I got back and I spoke to my dad and I told him what had happened. We had this conversation, and then over the next 2 weeks, me, my dad, my solicitors, we were all like this, almost like a Suits team, like the TV show Suits. Me and my dad were like lawyers, and we were gathering all this information and evidence to put our case forward. And at one point during that, I said to my dad, like, it was weird, you know, when I was in that car, I just put my foot down on the pedal. I wanted to drive into the bridge, and I mentioned it, and it was kind of like brushed off, but it wasn't, my dad shouldn't have flagged that. He wouldn't have known, you know? And you've got to remember that, like, back then, even then when I was 23, like, the attitude towards, like, seeing a sports psychologist was, well, the attitude towards seeing a physio was, if you go to the physio, they'll stop you training. If you go see the doctor, they'll stop you competing. If you go see the sports psychologist, there's something wrong with you, you're weak, so you won't get on the team. So no one went to see the sports psychologist. It was frowned upon. It wasn't normal. It wasn't normalised back then. So I just kept all of these emotions inside my head again. But I think that period after 2016, I never really dealt with those issues and the feelings that I had. And I was a bit numb. And I just rolled into the next 4 years in the chapter of my life without ever dealing with anything really. And I had a lot of life change in early 2017. So I left home for the first time and bought a flat. And when I bought this, I was renting, so I rented in this flat. And when I first moved in, I remember it like it was yesterday. My dad kind of left me at the door. And I was like, oh, that's it, I'm on my own now. And I had a TV on the floor with no stand. I had no sofa. I had like a little camping table that I used for my dinner, and I was just on my own. And I spent a long time there. I spent a few months. I think I spent nearly 6 months on my own, living on my own, until Andy and my brother moved in. And they both wanted to move in. But I think ultimately what I was trying to do was I didn't want to be on my own. And I kind of like asked them to move in with me because, yeah, at that time I'd started to struggle a little bit with, again, that isolation I had as a teenager. I was feeling really lonely. And that's one thing that I don't think is talked about much, like in young people. But when I was 24, 25, and even when I was living with Jack and Andy, there were times where I was like crippled with loneliness. And it was like a pain in my stomach. I felt it here. It was there. It sat there like this ball of something inside my stomach and my chest. And I would sit there on my own, and like sometimes I remember being once we had lived in our flat in West Bridgford, we moved to Lady Bay, and we were in a great big old house. It was brilliant, but it was really big, and the rooms were massive and the ceilings were super high. And Jack would go out on Saturday nights. And I remember one time like not going out because I was training, so I wasn't going out. And again, with that extreme behaviour, it was one or two things. It was all or nothing. Either I went out and drank myself into oblivion, or I didn't go out and I lived the perfect lifestyle for like a year. And so I can remember sitting on the bed just crying my eyes out, just feeling lonely and feeling like, this is so embarrassing. I'm like a young man in my 20s and I'm sat here crying because I feel so lonely, you know? And I just internalised all of that shame inside of me, I guess. And going into 2019, and I guess this is the big one. This is the one this is the saddest for me looking back. And I really think at that point someone should have stepped in. But going into the start of 2019, I was under a lot of pressure. So I'd been told in my 6-month review meeting. So every year, if you're on one of the Olympic sports GB teams, you're given a review. So at the start of the year, you have a review, and it's targets based. So what the coaches are looking for from you, results, scores, and that determines how much funding you get. And in my 6-month review, so halfway through the year, I was told, look, Sam, you need to get some results here, or potentially we're going to have to take you off the team. So I knew I was under a lot of pressure, and I'd gone to a World Cup in Paris, And I did really well in this competition, again, under extreme amounts of pressure with only 5 weeks notice for this competition. And I'm trying to, again, try and almost hit a Hail Mary and have a brilliant competition, win a medal. I got into the high bar final, and it was an amazing event looking back. It was just me and Sergey. There was 12,000 people in this arena in Paris. I did a great high bar routine. I finished 5th. It was a great, that was one of the last times I ever competed in front of a big crowd in gymnastics. And again, I made the same mistake, and after the competition, I was under so much pressure, and I didn't know what to do. And at this point, I didn't have a partner. Like, I felt isolated. Definitely didn't have any friends. My gymnastics wasn't going well. I was getting told I was going to be taken off the squad. I went out and drunk myself into oblivion again, which I was really ashamed of, because I felt like, come on, like, Sam, you're nearly 26 now. You've got to learn from your lessons. You're 25. You're a man now. You can't keep making these mistakes. But it was a habit. I didn't know any different. And going into that Christmas and the start of that year, again, under extreme amounts of pressure, and I was doing anything, you know. I was the perfect athlete in many ways. And the national coaches at the time said this. They said, Sam, if every athlete on our squad was like you, it'd be unbelievable, but we just need you to get some results. And I just couldn't understand why I couldn't put it together anymore. And I was looking for like a silver bullet. So I'd try everything. I can remember at one point, I'd watched a documentary with Lomachenko, one of the best boxers in the world. And he was saying how he would practice holding his breath underwater for 4 minutes. So I can remember thinking, right, that sounds good. Maybe if I can hold my breath underwater for 4 minutes, that's going to help my gymnastics, which I'm looking back now, I'm like, it's absolutely bonkers. And the other thing I tried to do, the other thing that I started doing was intermittent fasting. So I'd listen to these Joe Rogan podcasts, and I'd listen to these MMA fighters, and I'd listen to George St. Pierre. Now, George St. Pierre's got an illness with his gut. So he intermittent fasts because of that. But I thought, wow, George St. Pierre, he's one of the best fighters of all time, and he does a bit of gymnastics training. Right, I'm going to try this. This might be it. If I start doing this intermittent fasting, this might be the thing that I'm missing, the key. Obviously, it wasn't, you know. And I went into 2019, and going into the start of the year, we had that profiling. So the profiling at the start of the year. And we had like a physical assessment. We had a conversation with a nutritionist. The physio would check us out. We'd have to do lots of exercises as well. So we'd do 20-meter sprint. We'd do shoulder cuff capacity. So you'd have to max out on this machine, trying to do 40 reps. We'd do leg presses. You'd do single leg press at 3/4 of your body weight. And it was so the coaches, but the strength and conditioning team could monitor what level you were at going into the year, you know, because ultimately it was all about injury prevention. And one of the conversations you had that day was with the psych. So I had a conversation with the team, and I basically said, I can't remember his name now, but he was a new sports psychologist, and I hadn't worked with him before. And I said, look, I'm really struggling, and I'm under a lot of pressure. I've been on this squad since I was 9 years old. I've never known anything different. I quit school at 14. Gymnastics is my life. I've given this everything. I gave up everything. I sacrificed my childhood in many ways. And that was my decision to do that. But I'm in a position now where that, for me, at that point, my whole self-worth and value was tied into my identity of being a gymnast and a professional gymnast. And if I wasn't going to be an Olympic gymnast, I was a GB gymnast. And that was going to be potentially taken away from me in a few months' time. And I said, I'm struggling. Like, I need some help. And he said, okay, leave it with me, Sam. And I have to stress that he worked for the EIS, so the English Institute of Sport. And they looked after me and kept me together throughout my whole career. They put me together after my ankle injury, and they're brilliant people. And they always supported me. And he said, we'll go and have a conversation. And I had an email the next week, and it said, hi, Sam, unfortunately, British Gymnastics decided that we can only support the top 5 guys on the team with psych support right now, so we can't give you any support. And you've got to understand that where I was in myself and my thought process at that time, and how I am as a person, like, I'm incredibly self-critical. So I just took that as, they're right, I'm not good enough, I don't deserve psych support right now. And if I want that, and if that's something I feel that could help me and get me back on track, I'm going to have to prove that by competing well and getting competition results. And so I put everything on the line going into the British Championships in 2019, but ultimately I was given a target that, you know, I did feel at the time it was a crazy target. I was asked to score 84. I think only a handful of gymnasts from Great Britain and come anywhere close to that score in the whole of that cycle. So it was an impossible task in many ways. I fell short of it. You know, I was doing the intermittent fasting and doing everything I possibly could, but I was massively underweight. You know, I didn't have the energy, didn't have a good performance. The inevitable happened and I was taken off the squad. And I remember just after that competition in 2019, my mum and dad were going on holiday with my little sister and they asked me if I wanted to go. And I thought, yeah, do you know what? Like, I've been taken off the squad emotionally, mentally. I felt beaten up. I'd taken a big hit. I'm going to go on holiday. And it's not until you're out of that, like I didn't understand how extreme my behaviour was until I had a conversation with my mum a year later. And like on that holiday, again, I wasn't doing any training. I was doing the intermittent fasting thing on holiday, which is like crazy. Like I'm a grown man, but I was waking up in the morning at 7 and I was swimming in the pool and I was doing some stretching and stuff. And then I'd have breakfast dead early in the morning and I wouldn't eat until dinner. Which looking back now, I'm just like, what? That's, you know, and my mum noticed, she knew, my dad knew, but they didn't know how to deal with that or handle the situation. It certainly wasn't going to be flagged by anyone anymore because I wasn't on the squad and I'd lost all that support. So I didn't have, you know, the guys around me, the medical team around me anymore. And that was definitely, you know, looking back now, that was a perfect indicator that I was not well. And I think my family, like, when it's somebody you love, you choose to see what you want to see. And I think the cogs were turning, they were noticing my behaviour. And then going into that summer, I developed a neck injury. So I was filming with Sam in the gym and, you know, I tweaked my neck again. And I'd do that every now and then. And I got this injury in my neck and it just got worse and worse and worse to the point where I couldn't even train. And I was getting pins and needles in my fingers and my right hand. My right hand was cold all the time. This nerve pain ran all the way down my neck, through my shoulder, all the way to the end of my fingertips. And it would come and go a little bit, but ultimately it got to the point where nearly every day I would go to the gym, I'd try to train, I might try and schedule a filming session with Sam, I'd say, sorry mate, I can't do it today, I can't train. I'd get to the gym, I'd try to run around, couldn't move my neck, I'd go home. And I was doing that and I just felt like a failure because the world was in many ways, like my world was telling me that I wasn't on the team anymore, I was getting older, you know, people were asking me about, oh, what are you going to do after gymnastics? What are you going to do when you retire? I didn't know the answers to these questions and, you know, all I wanted and all I felt I had in my life at that time was gymnastics, but I couldn't get that right, so I just felt useless. And going into that summer, it got to the point where, you know, the only thing I felt I could do in a day that was useful was go to the sauna at David Lloyd. And David Lloyd for me was a lifesaver because it gave me a little bit of a community and I would go to the gym, not be able to train, which happened literally every single day. I'd go to the gym, I'd talk to Sergey for 10 minutes and I'd go home and I'd drive to David Lloyd and I'd sit in the sauna because I didn't have to move my neck in the sauna. And it was the only thing that I felt like I could do that was productive. But really what I was doing was I knew that I wasn't training, so I was going to put on weight. So I was sitting in the sauna to sweat the water out, which, like, looking back again, it's just really like just negative, you know. It's like unhealthy behaviour. But the great thing about David Lloyd was that every other day or so I would see someone and they'd have a little conversation with me. And I was so lonely at this point that, like, I'd have a 2-minute conversation with someone and it'd lift my mood and I'd, like, be up. Just that engagement with someone else would, like, lift me up and it'd give me a little boost. And then 2 minutes after, I'd be back down again. And it was around this time, and I'd moved in with my grandparents, I was living with them, that I'd started getting this, like, it was almost that pain I had, that thing in my stomach of loneliness. In 2018, when my brother would go on nights out, I'd be by myself and I'd be there crying. That feeling, it was there all the time. It never went away. It was like a buzz and a hum that was just always there in the background. And it was, I didn't know what it was. I know what it is now, but it was a physical pain I could feel in my stomach. And I'm sure part of that sometimes was that I was starving. I was hungry because I was still doing this intermittent fasting thing. But it was anxiety and I didn't know what that was. And at the time I wasn't sleeping either. So my neck was so painful that I couldn't sleep with a pillow and I would lie in my bed, bolt upright like this, flat, trying to lengthen my neck, trying to keep it nice and long, to stretch it out so the discs weren't compressing on that nerve. And I just wouldn't sleep. I didn't sleep for weeks, months even. Just wasn't getting any sleep. In extreme pain, my fingers and my arm hurting the whole time. Always cold, pins and needles. And eventually I came into the gym and I said to Sergey, I came in one day and I just said, "Sir, I can't do this anymore. Like, I can't do it. There's nothing left in me. This isn't working. Like, I need to stop. I don't know what's wrong with me. There's something wrong with me and I need to stop what I'm doing because it feels dangerous." And I had a conversation with a coach in the gym that was in that afternoon called Jonathan, and he was a good friend of mine, and we had this conversation, and, you know, he said all the right things to me. He was telling me, "Sam, you know, like, you've done so much already in your career. Like, you need to be happy, you know. You need to wake up every day and be excited for life again, and if you need to stop right now, that's what you need to do." And at the same time that week, and the same day, I went to see the doctor. And it's a doctor that's known me since I was about 18. And she's based out of Loughborough, again with the EIS. And I went in and I said, "Look, Kate, I'm struggling with my neck. I can't move." I'd been to see her previously about this. I was like, "Is there anything that we could do?" I still had hopes of this neck pain going away and trying to get myself back onto the GB team at the end of that year, because I still had hopes of going to the Olympic Games in 2020 in Tokyo. And she basically said, "I'm going to organise like an MRI scan for your neck because we need to get to the bottom of it and figure out what it is." I had this conversation with her, and for some reason I just kind of, in that room, there were like windows right at the top of the room, and I kind of, for some reason, looking out a window and talking about things that are very difficult is a bit easier for me than looking in someone's eyes directly. And I kind of just opened up a little bit to her, and when I walked out, I'm sure she sensed that everything wasn't okay. I kind of walked out the room and then I like put my foot through the door and kept it ajar, and I just looked in and I said, "Kate, you know, if I'm stressed, could that be affecting my neck?" And she said, "Yeah, of course." She said, "A lot of people carry stress in different ways. Some people it's their back, some people it comes out in their skin, some people it's their stomach, and some people they carry stress in their neck." And she was like, "Do you want to sit down?" I said, "Yeah, all right." And I sat down and she said, "Look, you know, there's other ways we can help you, and I can help you, other than just, you know, with your physical injuries." She said, "We can help you with your mental health as well." I said, "Right." She said, "Would you be willing to fill out a form for me?" And I don't know what it was. I think it was probably that not wanting to look weak. It was part of the problem in the beginning. I went, yeah, I'll fill out the form, not a problem. So I start filling out this form. And it's like a tick box question form. And every single answer is not, I'm ticking the box that I shouldn't be. And for me, it was that writing it down and seeing it written in ink that I got to the end of this piece of paper and I went, I've got a problem. And she said, "Look, Sam, would you be open to me reaching out to a mental health clinic and potentially looking at getting you therapy?" And I think in that moment, like when I saw it on paper, I had a bit of a realization that, oh yeah, maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not just being weak and I'm, you know, maybe actually I'm ill. That I kind of just put my hands up and went, "Help me. I want to sleep again. I've not slept for months. I want this feeling in my stomach to go away. I don't want to feel that. I love life. I'm a person that loves life." And at that point, I was basically not wanting to wake up in the morning and wanting to go to sleep as quick as possible to make it go away. And I got referred to a mental health clinic in Nottingham, and I went there for my first session. And again, like I said, like the attitude in my sport for a long time had been, you don't go and see someone about your mental health, it means you're weak. And, you know, I went there with a lot of trepidation, had no idea what the difference between counselling and therapy was. And I have to say, I'm very lucky that there was a support system there to allow me to explore therapy, because not everybody has that. And it was expensive. And I was lucky in that I'd been to see her 2 weeks before. Essentially, after you get taken off a GB squad, you have like a 3-month extension period where you have access to physios, doctors, sports psychologists, nutritionists as like a bit of a transition period. It's the same in every single sport. And I just been in the deadline, and she'd had to have conversations with British Gymnastics and the head medical team there to sign off putting me into therapy. So that did get signed off, and I'm really grateful for that, because for me, it saved my life. It 100% saved my life. And I went into this session and I met the therapist, and we sat down in this little room, and there was 2 chairs. And basically, for the first 2 sessions, she just sat and listened to me. And I just told, you know, in many ways, the story that I'm telling you guys now. And it wasn't until probably the second half of the second session that she started to engage and ask me questions. And what was really weird was that I just thought it was her job to sit and listen to me. And she started pushing back. And I was confused by that. And she started pushing back on ideas I had and the narratives I'd built in my head that I wasn't talented, I had to work harder than everybody else, and that it was my issue that, you know, I couldn't get back on the GB team. And she said it was such basic, fundamental things that she was explaining to me, but for some reason it took somebody else like her that I'm sure has incredible listening skills and has dealt with hundreds of people in a similar situation to me, albeit not exactly the same, because everybody's different and everyone's experience with mental health is different, to go, oh yeah, that makes sense. And over the course of the next few weeks, it was really difficult for me. Every time I went to have one of those sessions, you know, we'd peel the layers of the onion and we'd go back into when I was a kid and growing up and being a teenager and the Olympic Games and my drinking and all of that behaviour and missing out on 2016, and we'd delve into everything, and I'd struggle. I'd be completely drained for days after those sessions because it was so emotionally charged still. And when I'd look back and I'd close my eyes and I'd imagine or talk about a memory, I'd feel those feelings I felt in that moment. But towards the end, I'd say probably 3/4 of the way through, I started to see what she was doing, and I saw the magic in therapy, and I was starting to connect the dots. And what therapy did for me was ultimately help me understand myself and know that if anybody had been through the set of circumstances that I had been through, they would think in the same way. It was normal. There wasn't anything wrong with me. Like, it was just the environment, the circumstances, who I am as a person, my personality. And that's how I was reacting to all of these situations. And it made sense for me, you know? And at the end of those sessions, I basically came away with a little piece of paper. It was like an A4 piece of paper and it was almost a profile of me and who Sam Oldham is and how I normally react to situations and some targets and goals for me. And I remember that one of the goals written on this piece of paper was to have birthday cake on my birthday. That was one of the goals on this piece of paper. And the day after I had my last therapy session, and what's interesting as well, that kind of period extension that I had, the money they had ran out, so I had to pay for the last session by myself, which was fine, like, but it was funny. It's kind of like a bit of a metaphor for, you know, my experience a lot of the time in the system. And that last session, I was buzzing, you know. I felt like myself again. I was happy. My neck had gone away, miraculously. And one thing that had come up and been flagged really quickly was in session 3 of my therapy. She became very concerned about my eating habits. And she said, Sam, I need to step in here and I need your permission to let me talk to the doctor. And I was really alarmed and like taken back. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, there's nothing, I've not got an eating problem. Like, I'm doing this because I'm trying to do better at gymnastics. I'm trying to get my gymnastics back on track. It's not an eating issue. And I was really taken back and kind of like, yeah, I had my back up about that. And my reaction was, I've not got an eating disorder, because I've experienced that with people around me, training partners, and family members at the time. I've seen that. I was like, that can't happen to me because I know about it. That isn't me. And yeah, she basically spoke to the doctor. They made me do a food diary, and we worked out that some days I was training 6 hours a day and I was eating less than 1,200 calories a day, which is, it's nothing, you know. I was starving myself. And of course, if you're, you're not eating properly, you're not fueling your body, you're not sleeping. I wasn't sleeping. It's going to have a massive effect on your body, your nervous system, injuries. And I started to eat 3 meals a day again, and I started to feel strong, get more energy in me. You know, my training picked up, my injuries started to go away. And that day that I left, that I came out of therapy, I walked out buzzing like a new man. That's it. It's solved. All my issues are gone. I'm going to be fine. I've had therapy. No more depression, anxiety. And I was on cloud 9. And I remember the next day, 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, go down West Bridgeford on the avenue, put a bet on United to beat Man City. I've told this story before. And later on in that morning, I broke both of my ankles. And straight away, that fact file and that profile sheet I had on myself came into action, and I had to put what I'd learned in that therapy into practice. And that was my first experience of really trying to manage my depression, anxiety and mental health, because I was in that position again where my gymnastics was taken away and I'd been so close, you know, I was happy. But I learned so much during that period, and I sat there and recovered with my granddad watching old Western films on the TV, and he had a bad ankle, so we both had our legs up, we were both icing our ankles, and it was brilliant. And I remember one night we'd gone out to celebrate, and Andy had come back. It was just before Christmas, and we'd gone on this night out. And I was in a good place at this point, you know. I wasn't heavily drinking and doing that kind of stuff anymore. I had a better relationship with alcohol, and we went on this night out, and all my friends were there, and I was having the best time, man. And that's the night that I met Connie. And the night that I met Connie was when I was the most myself. At that point, I'd kind of gone through this therapy, and a lot of it was kind of letting go of all my insecurities, you know, and being comfortable in my own skin with who I was. And I met her when I was the most myself I've ever been in my life, and I'm so happy that that's when I met her, because it was the right time, you know. And she came into my life, and she was like a guardian angel. I always used to tell her when I first met Connie, you've saved me. You don't understand. Like, she didn't know at that point the story and the journey I'd been on, and she just fell in love with me for me. She didn't even know she didn't know I was a gymnast. She had no idea. She just loved me for me and my personality. That meant so much to me. And so going into the 2020 and the start of that year, my training I was flying in the gym. I was in this relationship with Connie. We were becoming best friends. Everything was going great. And then March 2020, the lockdown rolls around, and you know, I'm in this situation where the gymnastics is taken away again. All the structure in my life is gone. I was told in that first week that my granddad had been diagnosed with cancer, and you know, I'd just been living with him for 10 months. I didn't know how to handle that, and you know, again, I was very quickly forced into facing my demons. And in many ways, the issues I they hadn't gone anywhere, and I had this like fear. It was like an elephant in the room in the back of my head that, God, I've turned this around so quickly. What if it comes back? And that was always going to happen, because I'm on this long journey. It might be a lifelong journey of me understanding myself and how I react to situations and my own personality, and understanding my depression, anxiety. And at this point, I didn't have those tools. I'd not worked on those tools yet to manage it when it comes back, because it had been fine. It had been kind of plain sailing. But I'd been worried it would, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. And in the beginning, like, it took me a long time to recognize that I was low again. I couldn't recognize it. It'd be like 6 or 7 days later, it'd hit me. So it'd start, and the pain would be back, the anxiety would be in there. I wouldn't be sleeping. I'd be feeling really bad about myself. A conversation in my head would be very negative, and I'd just have this feeling again, you know? And in that lockdown, it was really, really tough. I found that really hard. And it gave me a lot of time to evaluate my life and think back and be on my own and think about the things that had happened to me through the course of my career. And I was still struggling with this identity crisis, you know? And I was now not able to train. I wasn't given an elite athlete exemption letter. So that made me feel pretty rubbish about myself. You're not good enough to get a letter to train like all the other lads in the country that are on the GB squad. And yeah, I had to deal with my mental health again, like head on. And that was the hardest for me. As much as the year before, when I finally spoke to the doctor and I got referred to the mental health clinic, was tough, and it really was, it was even harder this time. And this time was really difficult because those feelings came back, but in certain areas of my life, so my relationship with Connie, I was happier than I'd ever been. And what was really tough for me was trying to explain to someone that you love that I am the happiest I've ever been, and I also don't want to be here anymore, and I want this pain to go away. And in the lockdown, it got to the point where I had to ring my brother, and my brother was in Australia. And at that February of that year, just before the lockdown, it was my birthday, funnily enough, that Jack flew to Australia for like the opportunity of his life to go and play for a football team in Australia. And Jack had always been my backbone. Jack had always been the person in my life that was able to tell me the truth. And I genuinely knew he had my best interests at heart and he loved me. And the funny thing about, I have to talk about Jack and Connie because they both saved my life. And Jack was, Jack always looked after me. I was his big brother, but he looked after me. You know, post 2012, I'd get into trouble in town and I'd get into fights, and it'd be Jack that would say, "What are you doing? You don't do that." And then he'd go and like take care of it. Or it was Jack when my ankle was smashed to smithereens at the Commonwealth Games that came in and said, "This isn't you. Like, Sam, this isn't you. You need to get back and, you know, stop drinking yourself to sleep every night here in this bed with your ankle up. You need to stop that." It was Jack that did that. And he was always there for me. And Jack was the person in 2019, at the end of 2019, he was somebody that saw it first in me, I think. And I dropped him off at the pub, and I remember him telling me, I'm so grateful that he was brave enough to do this, right? I dropped him off at the pub and he was going to see his mates. And he said, "Do you know what, mate? For a long time I've been thinking that, like, you can still do it in your head. I believe in you, but your body can't do it anymore, and you need to accept that." And it felt like someone stabbed me. It was like the biggest gut punch ever. Like my brother, my best friend, the person that believes in me the most is telling me that, you know, I can't do it anymore. But actually, that was the bravest thing and the best thing anyone had ever told me. And it was because he had my best interests at heart. And he was right. My body was just worn out and it was tired from those imaginary 12 hours I was doing every single day in the gym that kid was telling his dad about. And I just wasn't able to take it anymore, you know? And when I was growing up and when I was younger, I was somebody that, up until like my early 20s, probably 2016, I could take anything you throw at me. It won't break me. I'm the toughest kid here. I always was in the gym. I was the toughest kid in the room. And I could take anything. And I just got to a point in 2019 where like that ceiling had been broken through, and then anything after that would completely floor me. And in 2020, in that February on my birthday, when we dropped Jack off at the airport and he was going away, I was petrified of not having that person there that, you know, probably knew me the most and knew my story and my journey and had been with me through the most difficult times and the very best times. And like, for me, like, I can remember that day I was driving from Connie's house back to Keyworth, and I had to pull over because I couldn't see because I was crying so much. And like, I'm a really emotional person, and I used to like never cry and never show any emotion. That's kind of like the sport bred me to be somebody that just doesn't show any emotion. And at that point, once I'd gone into therapy, the floodgates were open, and I would just cry at everything. And I can remember putting music for me, like, I love music. It's a big part of my life. And it was a song by Jack Garrett. It's called Time. It's a beautiful song. And I put that on, and now it always takes me back to that day when Jack was leaving to go to Australia, and the water was streaming down my face. But the cool thing was, we got to the airport, and it was my mum, my dad, my brother, and my sister. And it was my birthday, and Connie had made me a cake. So that thing that was on my profile and my target to have birthday cake on my birthday, I made sure I took the cake to the airport, and we sat there in the airport and we had my birthday cake on my birthday, and we said goodbye to Jack. And I can remember I nearly collapsed. My legs just went all weak, and we said goodbye to him. I was so upset. And but we kept in touch, and I spoke to him all the time. Not as much as I should have. I feel bad about that now, having gone traveling and realized, God, how lonely it can be at times and how difficult it is when you're on the other side of the world. And I know that Jack faced his own challenges while he was out in Australia. But he was the person that, within that lockdown, on that morning, when I knew that something was wrong, that I rang up, and I'm so grateful I was able to say to him, Jack, I've been thinking about taking my own life. And I mean, what a conversation to have with your little brother. And I was walking around Keyworth and I said, like, please don't tell mum and dad, because like I'm going to be okay. I'll be okay. I just needed to tell someone that I'm feeling, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm feeling that. And that night I realized what I'd done, and I'd just put this unbelievable weight on his shoulders while he was on the other side of the world and couldn't do anything about it. And I feel really guilty for that, but I'm so glad and I'm so lucky that I was so close with my little brother that I could have that conversation. And the next morning I knew what I had to do. I knew that that wasn't fair, and I had to tell my mum and dad, because they were here and they needed to know, and they could look after me and make sure I was safe. And so it was just a normal morning. I'd had breakfast, I was nervous and shaking, and my dad was going to go out to work because my dad was able to work at that point. And my mum asked, I said to my mum, "Mum, can I have a conversation with you and Dad?" And my dad was about to leave, and my mum said, "Bobby, Sam wants to talk to us." And they came in and they sat down, and I was doing that thing where I wasn't really looking at them, and I basically said, I've been thinking about taking my own life, and I don't want to die. And they just came and like hugged me straight away, and they were crying, and it was like the biggest relief and weight off my shoulders. And in those moments that I told Jack, and I told my mum and dad, and then somewhat just as hard, I had to tell Connie, and I had to explain to Connie that you make me so happy, and I'm so happy with my life. And like, but I also like, I have this thing in me where I don't want to be here anymore, and I want the pain to go away, and I don't know how to make it go away. When I had that conversation with all of them and they all put their arms around me and hugged me, it made me feel safe, because someone knew where I was at. They knew what I was feeling. Like, that was so important for me that I had those people around me, and not everybody does. But it was important that they knew where I was, because I didn't want to go anywhere. I didn't know what this was. I didn't understand it. And when I was growing up and people would talk about mental health when I was in my 20s, I'd say that's not a thing. What are you talking about? You're just weak. Like, that's what I thought in my head. I thought mental health was just feeling a bit down, having a bad day. What I had was an illness. It was real, man. It was something that's hard to explain unless you've ever been in it. And once I had that conversation with them, my mum very quickly said, because at the time it's funny that I can laugh about it now, but I was walking the dog every day by myself. And I was basically walking the dog on my own. And like, where I'd gotten to and the point I was at, I was like visualizing ways in which I could take my own life. My mum quickly said, "You are not walking that dog on your own anymore." I said, "Okay, that's fair enough." Right. And that was tough. And luckily, like, the year before, my mum was the person I went to first. And she was incredible, because I've learned now, I'm not a parent yet. I really hope to be one day soon. And I've learned that parents, they will just want to fix problems for their children. It's like a natural thing. If you go to your mum and dad with a problem, they want to fix it for you right there, right then, you know, because you are an extension of them. And I learned that through my granddad passing away recently, because he still spoke about my dad and my Uncle Mitch like they were kids, but they always will be in his eyes. They're his kids, his children. And what my mum was on, what she didn't do, I think she understood that she couldn't fix this, and she just sat and listened to me. And she was unbelievable, my mum was. And, you know, I'd slowly built up this relationship with them where I felt like I could share things. And it was hard, don't get me wrong. I mean, with Connie, you know, and this period went on for a long time, you know. And I remember, like, I would have almost like a tally chart in my head. If I went a week without being depressed, I'd be like, yeah, I've gone a week. And then I'll be like, oh, 2 weeks this time, and 3 weeks and 4 weeks, and it get to like 5 or 6, and I'm panic and be like, oh no, I'm doing really well. This time it might be gone forever. What happens if? And I'd say to Connie, I've done 7 weeks, and she'd say, Sam, you shouldn't think like that. You know, like, it doesn't work like that. It's not just going to magically go away. Like, this is going to be a long process. And, you know, I learned that, and I still do struggle with my mental health at times now. I just have a deeper understanding of myself. And what had happened was, and the beautiful thing about telling those people and being brave enough but open enough and having those people to talk about this too, it meant that they now knew what to look out for in me. So they knew that if I went quiet, if I stopped communicating, if, you know, Connie's the best at this, she'll go, "Are you okay?" And I'll go, "Yeah, what are you talking about?" She'll be like, "Are you okay? You're different today. You're low." And in the beginning, people would notice that behavior in me and they would ask me, "Are you okay?" And that's been really important to have different people in different areas of my life that are aware of what I struggle with. And also, they now know, okay, this situation for Sam, like his granddad passing away, that's going to be very difficult because he was very close with him. So I'm going to make sure that every now and then I just check that he's okay. And if he disappears and he goes quiet, I'll just send him a message, or I'll call him, or I'll ask him twice if he's okay. I'll ask him if he's okay the first time, because the first time, you know, if you ever see one of your friends or your family and say,